Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. This is Jonathan E. with the Thermopylae Information Network. The Ministry of Truth is now up and running in the United States of America. I can't believe that this is really happening. It's almost like Ministry of Truth, in case you're not familiar with it, is a reference to George Orwell's 1984. If you haven't read the book, I would highly recommend it. It's one of my favorites. If you're really not into reading, the BBC back in the 80s, coinciding with the year 1984, as a matter of fact, if I remember right, came out with a movie version of it starring John Hurt, which is also excellent. If you haven't seen or read either one of those, I highly recommend that you do. It's a great work of fiction, and I can't believe all these years later that True Life is actually emulating art. Anyway, it seems that YouTube has taken it upon themselves, and not just YouTube, there's other tech companies out there as well. I believe Google's one of them. Probably all the rest of them will be following up soon too. That they have taken it upon themselves to determine what is true and what is not true. And based on what they believe the truth to be, they're going to suppress your video. It's still going to be available on YouTube, but it's not going to come up in the recommendations. I watched a very excellent video earlier from another YouTuber. His YouTube name is Sticks Hexenhammer 666. This guy does fantastic work. I highly recommend any of you that have never heard about it or never heard of him, go on and check out his channel. This guy is absolutely amazing. The amount of research and his presentation, excuse me, is fantastic. I watched this guy do election analysis before the 2016 election and the 2018 election. He's an extremely intelligent, very knowledgeable gentleman. He does great presentations. He did a fantastic presentation on this whole YouTube thing. So I would highly recommend that you check him out as well. But apparently the program must be up and running. He's got a very popular channel, and the amount of views that I saw on his station today, I don't think is anywhere near what he would normally have. Our channel has only been up for a couple of weeks now, and we're not that popular. You know, I mean, it's a building process, but I've noticed about an 80% reduction just within the last 2-3 days from what we were getting a couple of weeks ago. Some of the other videos that I did were even more controversial, or rougher language, whatever, than the ones that I've done the last few days, and it's like an 80% reduction. So they must be censoring the content some way, shape, or form. They're censoring content based on the idea that they want to control conspiracy theories such as 9/11, Pizzagate, other kinds of crap like that. So they're going to determine for you what the truth is. And they're also going to be censoring what they call marginal content, something that doesn't really quite violate their bylaws, but to them it's just kind of something that they don't think that the public should be having access to. This is straight out of 1984, the Ministry of Truth, which was anything but the Ministry of Truth. It was actually a ministry that controlled propaganda, thereby controlling the narrative and controlling people's minds. All throughout the novel, basically, whatever they say that they're doing is the complete opposite. It's called doublespeak. Ministry of Truth actually controlled propaganda. The Ministry of Peace actually controlled war. In the novel, what they do is basically they go back and they alter news articles. They alter all kinds of stuff to reflect whatever the government's changed its mind from. Chocolate rations, whether they're at war with Oceania was them, whether they're at war with Asia or Eurasia. Whatever the government decided, Winston Smith, the main character in the novel, he would be part of the people that would go back and alter everything to make sure that people didn't get any opinion other than what the government wanted. And when the government decided that somebody had breached the law, they'd basically make them disappear. You'd go to room 101, the torture room, and then they would go in and make you an unperson. So this is where we're going here. It's really kind of sad to see. I know that a lot of these companies believe that free speech only applies, or that the violation of free speech only applies to the government. The New York Times has sued repeatedly to be able to exercise their free speech But they somehow or another, companies like this, and not so much the New York Times, but they believe that suppressing other people's speech is perfectly fine because they're a corporate entity and they're not bound by the Constitution. This is a dangerous slope that they're going down, and I would say that based on the power that some of these companies have, especially the tech companies, you pretty much are at this point acting as a government agent. So you should be bound by this, and you shouldn't be stifling people's speech. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read some quotes that I dug up. A lot of these have to do with Supreme Court cases. The first one is a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, and this was in a case Schwimmer versus the United States. And he said, quote, "If there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is free thought. Not for thought that we agree with, but for thought that we hate." Okay? So for all you snowflakes out there that think that you shouldn't have to hear something you don't agree with, well, there's a Supreme Court justice who's got numerous cases in the past. He's a very well-known and extremely respected Supreme Court justice from many years ago. Apparently you think you're smarter than him. Another one is Noam Chomsky, and I've read Chomsky for years. I don't necessarily agree with his point of view now based on Trump. I think Chomsky's kind of lost his mind a little bit. He used to be a lot fairer than he is now. He used to be a lot more principled, but he has to sell books, so now he's kind of changed his mind on some things. This is a quote from Noam Chomsky from the book Common Good. "Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for the views he liked. So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for the views that you despise." Okay. Another one is William O. Douglas, who was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He said in a case that was Memoirs versus Massachusetts, 1966, "The censor is always quick to justify his function in terms that are protective of society." Where have you heard that before, that they're trying to protect society from people hearing these views? Now, to finish it here, "But the First Amendment, written in terms that are absolute, deprives the state of any power to pass on values, propriety, or morality of a particular expression." So in other words, even the government doesn't have the right to say what should or shouldn't be said. So how can a tech company have the right to say what should or shouldn't be said? Okay. Here's another one. I believe this is also from William O. Douglas. This is, it is. It's a speech that he gave to the New York Authors Guild in 1952. "Restriction of free speech and thought is the most dangerous of all subversions. It is the one most un-American act that could easily defeat us." Well, it doesn't appear that some of these tech companies really have a big concern of that, or maybe their plan is to defeat us. This one is a quote from Hugo Black, who was also a Supreme Court justice. "We would, I think, more faithfully interpret the First Amendment by holding that at the very least it leaves the people and the press free to criticize officials and discuss public affairs with impunity. This nation of ours elects many officials at many different levels, and these officials are responsible to the people for the way they perform their abilities." You notice a couple of things there? He wasn't just talking about the press, he was talking about the people. Well, we of us who post things on YouTube, we are people, all right? So apparently, again, YouTube thinks that they're more intelligent, and their lawyers think that they're more intelligent than Supreme Court precedent. This right here is really interesting. This is a quote from Frederick Douglass. Okay, Frederick Douglass was a freed slave back in the 1800s. He actually wound up running for vice president. I don't think he wanted to run for vice president, but he was nominated to the vice presidency for the Equal Rights Party. I believe it was 1878. He was actually running with a woman, Victoria Woodhull. So another interesting lesson here for some of you people before I read his quote. If you think that women and minorities were locked in cages before the 2000s, actually a black man ran for vice president and a woman was running for president under the Equal Rights Party. Okay. That's something maybe you ought to look up. There's a whole world of information out there that they hide in things called books. And this is available for you to avail anytime you would like. So instead of believing a bunch of hype bullshit, why don't you go learn something for once? Another interesting thing too was that Frederick Douglass actually opposed Abraham Lincoln in the, I believe it was the 1864 presidential election. He threw his weight behind John C. Fremont because Lincoln refused to come out and advocate for voting rights for free blacks. So again, all of you that think that Lincoln's this hero that stood up for the rights of black people, well, here's a real black hero, Frederick Douglass, who didn't agree with you. So Frederick Douglass said, "Liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It is the right that they first of all strike down because they know its power." Again, that's dedicated to you people over there at YouTube. You're tyrants. I mean, that's pretty much what he says here. You want to stifle people's free speech, and it must be because you're afraid of something. I mean, it's the only thing that I can come to. You're not doing it to help people. You're not doing it to save people. You're doing it because you want to control. Wendell Phillips, who was an abolitionist back in the 1800s, his famous quote here that I'm going to say was, "He who stifles free discussion secretly doubts that what he professes to believe is really true." So maybe that applies to YouTube too. Maybe you think that people like you that have all that power would be a little more comfortable in your own self-worth. My last quote here is from William Brennan Jr., who was also an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. His quote here was from the New York Times versus Sullivan, where he said, "Authoritative interpretations of the First Amendment guarantees have consistently refused to recognize an exception for any test of truth, whether administered by judges, juries, or administrative officials, especially ones that put the burden of proof of truth on the speaker." Think about that one for a while. You know, like I said before, I can't believe that we're living through this, but for all of you out there that still think this is a video game, you still think that this is just something, you know, this is what doublespeak is, where people say one thing and they actually exercise another. And you got a lot of tech people out there that talk about freedom of speech, but they don't really believe in it. Just like you have politicians that talk about gun control when they hide behind people with guns. This is just a way to basically confuse people. It's a way to get you to agree that you shouldn't have any rights. But of course, none of those restrictions apply to any of them, just like in 1984. Another movie you guys might want to really be interested in that kind of goes along the same lines is Harrison Bergeron. I'll be doing a review of that one. It's an excellent book. It's actually a short story from Kurt Vonnegut, but the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation made a movie out of it starring Sean Astin that extends it into a lot more of a detailed look. And in that situation, it's the same thing. People basically are all forced to be equal, except the people who rule. There's no restrictions on them. There's no handicaps on them to make them equal. And apparently that's what we have a lot of people in this country that have such a underdeveloped sense of self-esteem that that's what they would rather see. They'd rather imprison people and make slaves out of them so that they can feel good about themselves. Anyway, this is Jonathan E. with the Thermopylae Information Network. Check out more of our videos. Subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends about this. Again, we got to get this information out there. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.